Hello again, I'm Miss Pollico, here to tell you more about ancient Egypt. So if you watched my last video, you'll remember I asked you what civilization is. And hopefully since then you've had maybe at least one or two conversations about it with people. Part of the reason I asked you to think about that is that in this series we'll be studying ancient Egyptian history starting around the time that Egypt became civilized. Egypt's past goes back much further than that. There were people living along the Nile River long before you could call Egypt a civilized nation. So, what is civilization? How would you know if you lived in one? What would be different if you didn't? For starters, let's think about food. If you ate food today, was it food that you grew yourself on your own land? Did you have to go hunting and catch something and kill something to eat today? Did you have to maybe go out in nature and look for natural foods that you could eat in order to make sure that you had a meal? My guess is you probably didn't, and hunting for food in the fridge doesn't count as hunting. Most people who live in civilizations don't have to hunt or forage or even grow their own food necessarily, although some of them choose to sometimes. Part of the deal with living in a civilization is that there are people, farmers, who grow enough food that almost everybody in the civilization can be fed by that, so that every single person doesn't have to spend their time hunting or foraging for food. That's one of the ways. Are you able to read or write? If the answer is yes, you live in a civilization, or at least you've encountered a civilization that you have to talk to. Writing is something that doesn't usually need to be invented until people form a civilized society, and we'll talk more about the reasons for that later on. Another sign of civilization is, are there big buildings? So look around in the world where you live. Are there tall skyscrapers, maybe pyramids, big churches, big government buildings like palaces or other halls of parliament or something like that? If there are, you live in a civilization. Hardly anybody ever feels a need to build buildings that big unless they've achieved the level of organization that we call civilization. I want to say, before we go much further, that these are basically just guidelines. Historians agree on a long list of features that make something a civilization, but they also agree that sometimes a civilized group of people will have only some of those features, not all of them, and will still say, yeah, they're a civilization. One of the other telltale signs of civilization is your society has levels to it. That means there are some people who are very wealthy and powerful, and others who are not so much, and lots of different levels in between. Most civilizations have some sort of hierarchy like that, with a powerful central leader who's in charge of most everybody else, and then different levels of power going down from there. These are all the basic guidelines of civilization, and we've named the most important ones, the ones that historians usually look for first when they're checking to see whether an ancient people could be counted as civilized. Being able to recognize the features of civilization is only part of this lesson, though. The most important question to ask ourselves is, what was the point? Why did people invent civilization? Was it just so that they could have big buildings and spend their time doing something other than hunting all day? That last one is a big part of it for sure, but there are other reasons as well. Let's look at ancient Egypt as a specific example. The ancient Egyptians, like many ancient civilizations, had to deal with certain natural disasters. Almost everybody in some part of the world has to deal with some kind of natural disaster at some point in their lives. The ancient Egyptians, living along the Nile River, as they mostly did, had to deal with floods. Like most large rivers, the Nile was prone to flooding, and those floods could be dangerous and unpredictable. Sometimes they could take away your entire house. The ancient Egyptians figured out that if many of them worked together, and by many I mean hundreds, even thousands, they could use the Nile floodwaters to their advantage. By working to dig canals, they could redirect the extra water so that it went to their crops instead of washing away their homes. The kind of leadership that was necessary to make a project like this happen is what turned into kings and eventually became pharaohs. The word pharaoh didn't get brought into use until the New Kingdom, which we're not going to talk about for a while. So let's just talk about kings for now. If you're not sure why you need a big strong leader to do that, think about any time you've tried to get all your friends to agree to work together on some kind of project. it isn't always easy. By following these leaders who would become kings, the ancient Egyptians could live their lives more safely along the banks of the Nile. If you're wondering, why didn't they just move away from the river? That wasn't really an option. Even in ancient times, though it wasn't quite as hot and dry as it is now, most of Egypt was a desert. It hardly ever rained in most of the country, so it wasn't really safe to get too far away from a natural source of water. You could die of thirst. So most human beings in ancient Egypt either lived near the Nile River or near a natural oasis somewhere in the western desert. So by inventing civilization, the ancient Egyptians could live more safely and could also have more food as they used the Nile waters to water their fields in this place where it hardly ever rained. So where does writing come into this? What does writing have to do with taming floods, or even why do we need writing in a civilization? Just to be clear, I'm not talking about language. I'm talking specifically about a language that gets written down. People everywhere, whether they're civilized or not, always have some form of language. Only civilizations have a need to invent writing. So, as is my habit, I would like you to think about why might these people have needed to invent writing? What was its purpose? What was so important about writing? I'll give you one clue. It's very similar to the reason the ancient Egyptians also had to figure out math, specifically geometry. And while you're thinking about that one, I'm going to share with you a question that a lot of my students ask me frequently. Why did the ancient Egyptians worship cats? How could you even think of not worshiping one of these creatures? And she's done. Think about these questions, be brave, have conversations with people you know. Please don't Google them. You can have such a more interesting experience if you don't. I'll see you in the future. No, the past. Farming. I have no idea. No.